Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. In our last session, we saw how and why World War I started, and today then we'll begin to fight that war. Specifically, we're going to focus on the fighting that's taking place on land. So let's go to those essential questions. First, we'll talk strategy, more really just German strategy, because honestly the Germans were the only ones who had a strategy going into this fight. We'll kind of find out why they needed to have a strategy and what that strategy really was. Now, what we'll also see is that World War I in Europe really takes place in two theaters, an Eastern Front and a Western Front. We'll take a look at what's happening on the Eastern Front with the fighting between Germany and Russia, and the Austrians too, and then also on the Western Front that is featuring fighting between the Germans and the British and the French, and what kind of fighting characterizes that war on the Western Front. Trench warfare, more particularly, and how is trench warfare waged, and what's it like for those people who experienced it. So it's the land war today, guys. Those are the essential questions. That's where we're headed today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So by 1914, August, everybody's declared war, and the major powers of Europe are lined up against one another in two distinct camps, two very obvious teams opposed to one another. On the one side, you have what we're now calling the Central Powers. This is Germany, Austria, their new ally, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. And if you look at the map over there on the right, you can tell why they call them the Central Powers. You see the countries there in purple. Literally, they run right down the center of Europe. They are opposed on the other side by who we're now calling the Allied Powers. This is the French, the British, the Russians, and their other bevy of allies in this group of countries. Oh, and don't forget Italy. Remember, Italy was originally in an alliance with Germany, but when war broke out, Italy declined to honor that alliance. And when Italy does join the war, they join the war on the other side, on the side of France and Britain. So we have these two distinct sides set up, ready to fight each other. But in reality, nobody is really ready to fight this war, because no one thought this war was really going to happen. As everyone was mobilizing and posturing and threatening war and threatening this and threatening that, everybody actually thought that everyone else was going to back down. Everybody thought that the other side would blink first, and the problem is nobody did. They pushed each other to the brink of war, thinking that everyone else would back off, and nobody backed off. And so no one's really ready for that war. Nobody's armies are really fully mobilized. And I'll say this, both sides are really expecting a short war. The Germans think they're going to beat the French very quickly. The French think they're going to beat the Germans very quickly. And so again, nobody's really prepared. They hadn't even stockpiled enough supplies to last more than 6 months. Nobody even had a strategy for fighting this war. Sure, war sounded like a great idea, but yeah, now that we have it, what are we going to do? Well, really, one country does have a strategy, and that's Germany. And Germany has a strategy because they have to have a strategy. They are facing what is really a nightmare scenario, and that is enemies on both sides. They have France in the west, and they have Russia in the east. And when France and Russia made their alliance, this is exactly what they intended to do. They wanted to put enemies on either side of Germany because they wanted Germany to face the prospect of what we call a two-front war. And the Germans are facing that now. But when France and Russia made their alliance years earlier, the Germans knew that this scenario could potentially play out, so they planned for it. And the guy who was the top general in the German army at the time, a fellow by the name of Alfred von Schlieffen, developed a plan that he hoped would help Germany avoid that two-front war. And of course, the plan's named after himself. It's called the Schlieffen Plan. And the whole thing really hinges on Russia first and foremost. The assumption that Russia would be very slow to mobilize. Russia doesn't have the industrial and military capacity that, say, a Germany or France has, so the assumption is that it will take Russia a while to be fully ready to fight a war. That being said, the Germans believe that they must attack France first. They'll invade France through Belgium, and they give themselves a 6-week window to defeat the French. Why 6 weeks? Because the last time Germany and France fought a war against each other, that'd be the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, it only took Germany 6 weeks to defeat France. They entered Paris, France surrendered, and it only took 6 weeks. So they assume that they can probably do the same thing again. So the plan is invade France through Belgium, knock France out of the war, boom, in 6 weeks, and then with the French having surrendered, you take your full brunt of your military and turn it to the east against Russia. You do not want to fight a two-front war. You face enemies on both sides, and that means you have to split your armies in half, weakening you in both areas. So the full purpose of the Schlieffen Plan is to avoid that two-front war. And so in early August, the Germans put that plan into action. On August 3rd, 1914, Germany begins their invasion. They need to invade through Belgium, but there's a problem. Belgium is a neutral country. They haven't taken a side in this war, and Belgium expects their neutrality to be respected. And so when the Germans attempt to invade France through Belgium, the Belgians refuse to allow them to enter. They basically tell them, this has nothing to do with us. We're a neutral country. We don't want any armies in here. We don't want anything to do with this war. The Germans insist that they must invade through Belgium, and the Belgians insist, if you do, we will fight you. And that's exactly what happens. When the Germans do invade, the Belgians put up a fight. And again, this is a problem for Germany, because their strategy is timing based. They must invade and capture France in 6 weeks. And the more time you spend fighting the Belgians, the less time it gives you to do your business in France. So the Belgians put up a fight, they slow down the Germans, and then the unthinkable happens. The Russians actually get involved in the war a lot faster than anybody thought. The Russians quickly get involved, and they actually attack first. The Russians invade Austria and attack Germany before either of those sides thought that it was possible. So here's Germany with their grand Schlieffen Plan to avoid the two-front war, and it's just not happening. So Germany is forced to do that one thing they absolutely did not want to do, and that's fight enemies on two fronts, both east and west. The French and British in the west, and the Russians in the east. And speaking of Russia and the east, let's see what's going on that eastern front. So Russia does enter the war a lot faster than anybody had expected. In early August of 1914, the Russians invade Austria very successfully, and they even attack Germany at its borders. Moving very quickly, they score some surprising early victories. And again, this is a real shocker to people because, most folks in Germany and in Britain and France didn't think Russia would be able to move that fast. But see, there's kind of a secret and a reason to this. The reason the Russians got into the war so quickly was because they did not fully mobilize. Everyone was right thinking it would take Russia longer to mobilize. The thing is, they didn't fully mobilize. Russia's ruler, its emperor, Tsar Nicholas II, believed that speed and surprise would be better than being fully mobilized. He figured that they could fully mobilize later, get in and hit the Germans and the Austrians fast and hard first. But when you do that, you run into lots of logistical problems. Because they're not fully mobilized yet, the Russian army is very, very poorly equipped. They have very few weapons. They don't even have one rifle to one soldier. It's something on the order of 3 soldiers to 1 rifle. They don't have enough ammunition. They don't have enough supplies. And quite frankly, their military leadership is poor at best. And so their success doesn't last. It's in early August when the Russians first invade and attack Austria and Germany, and by late August, the whole thing has pretty much gone bust. In late August of 1914, Russia suffers a disaster of a defeat at the hands of the Germans at the Battle of Tannenberg. The Russians, with their very poor military leadership, their generals can't agree on what to do, and on top of that, they communicate openly in non-coded messages across open radio waves. And so the Germans just turn on their radios, translate the Russian, and they know exactly what the Russian army is going to do. So with this intelligence, they know the Russian army movements. They surround this entire Russian army group and completely annihilate them at Tannenberg. Russia loses over 30,000 soldiers killed and over 90,000 taken prisoner. It's an absolute debacle for the Russian army, something from which they will not fully recover for the rest of the war. Now, will they continue to fight? Yeah. Will they keep Germany busy on the Eastern Front? Yeah, but they won't really pose a major, major threat to Germany anymore, other than just being a nuisance in the East. Let's jump over to the west now, because back on the Western Front, Germany's finally defeated the Belgians, and they're slowly pushing into France towards Paris. But on September 5th, 1914, the French finally muster up enough gusto to stop the German advance at the Battle of the Marne. Literally, this is just miles away from the city of Paris. So the Germans got close, but not quite close enough. With this French victory, the Germans have to completely abandon the Schlieffen Plan. There was a chance it could have worked, but now it's just not happening. Instead, the war shifts into a new phase into the West, something that historians like to call the race to the sea. Because what you have is a series of battles in which each side is trying to reach the North Sea before the other. The goal is to turn the flank and be able to surround the other guys. Unfortunately, no one is successful, and what you have by November is a stalemate. No one's been able to outflank the other side. No one's been able to get the advantage. And so with the war in a stalemate, both sides settle down into the stable front line that stretches all the way from Switzerland to the North Sea. And the war that everybody thought was going to be over quickly, everyone figures out very quickly now that it's going to take a long time for this thing to play itself out. So with the war at a stalemate and with this stable front line, soldiers begin to dig into trenches to create fortified positions against enemy attacks. And trench warfare is going to be the nature of the fight here on the Western Front. These trench lines stretch almost 500 miles, nearly unbroken from the North Sea to Switzerland, all along these battle lines. And in this trench warfare scenario, you heavily fortify your trenches against enemy attacks. Because see, even though we've got all kinds of new military technology, the military strategy hasn't changed very much. Generals still favor these ridiculous open field mass charges straight at the enemy, and that just doesn't work with the new technology. In the Napoleonic era, when you have single shot muzzle loading rifles, you can make that work. But when you're running into the teeth of repeating rifles and heavy machine guns, you're asking for all kinds of trouble and a huge body count. So we've got new technology, but we don't have new strategy to match up with it. So here we are, trench warfare. People are digging trenches to protect themselves against the enemy attacks. You line the front of your trench with rows and rows of barbed wire, bury landmines in front of your trench to protect the area in front of it. And so what you have in between the trenches is this open, vast, desolate space that we call no man's land. Why call it no man's land? Because everything out there that might once have been alive is now dead. If you look to the right-hand side of the screen, you've got nice aerial photos of the trench lines on both sides. And if you see that big empty space in the middle, pockmarked with impact craters from artillery shells, that's no man's land. Nothing out there is alive. That's where the fighting mainly takes place. And the only things you'll find out there are, impact craters, spent shells, and dead bodies. You'll hardly find any trees. You won't see birds singing. You won't find insects on the ground, and you won't find any grass. It is just dead space. And the two sides are constantly shelling each other with heavy artillery, firing small arms rounds at each other. It's just a constant state of war. And of course, when there's a major offensive going on, it gets even more intense. And soldiers live in these trenches for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. And they're fighting not just the enemy, but they're fighting their own fear and their own boredom in the midst of it all too. Because even though you're being, shot at and shelled constantly, you're not always seeing action from the other side. So you're living in these trenches, horrific conditions, fear, boredom, the whole bit is facing you. The trenches are cold. They're muddy. Trenches are literally just holes in the ground. So when it rains, it becomes a hole in the ground filled with mud. And not just filled with mud and soldiers, but they're also filled with rats and diseases. And in some cases, the bodies of the dead. A lot of soldiers die of illness and infection in the trenches. Really, just as many guys die from infection as do die from war wounds. A very common infection in the trenches was something called trench foot. Trench foot was actually a fungus that would infect a soldier's wet feet. And this could lead to amputation of the foot or leg, or in really severe cases, even death. And when an order to attack was finally given, soldiers did what they called charging over the top of their trench. They'd climb out of the top of their trench and they'd rush out into that no man's land, that dead space. And there they'd face artillery, landmines, heavy machine guns, even horrible things like poison gas. And you would run to the enemy's trench and try to take out as many of them as you could. And in most cases, your side was eventually repelled by an entrenched enemy and you ran back to your trench. You know what the enemy did? They got out of their trench and they ran back at you until you killed enough of them that they ran back and hid in their trench. And back and forth, this brutal, bloody, really useless trench warfare went on and on and on. And this is the way the war was fought on the Western Front. Back and forth in this manner, slowly wearing each other down, killing countless thousands of soldiers in a brutal, useless war of attrition. Well, guys, that's a good spot to stop for today. We looked at the strategy, mainly Germany's strategy, to avoid fighting that two-front war, the Schlieffen Plan. But it was really blown up when the Belgians put up a fight and the Russians got into the war a lot faster than anybody thought. And speaking of the Russians, on the Eastern Front, they had some early success, but after Tannenberg, they were really a non-factor. And on the Western Front, we see a stalemate where the Germans, the French, and the British are settled down into that icky, nasty, bloody, plotting trench warfare. So guys, those are the essential questions. That is what we covered today. Make sure you study those and be ready to talk about that stuff the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.